They came for her siblings at dawn, declaring blood is blood, and branding her a forgotten girl. The wagon wheels cracked as relatives she'd never known dismounted, their eyes cold with entitlement. But Maren didn't tremble. She pushed herself from the splintered porch, dust swirling at her boots, and reached for the hand of a stranger, Silas Beckett, a man who never asked about her past or judged the scars she carried. With a voice steady as steel, she declared, "I choose the one who stayed, not the ones who ran." In that heartbeat, her name was reborn, no longer Maren Oakes, abandoned and nameless, but Maren Beckett, forged in defiance and hope. What came before carved wounds of pain? What followed ignited a blaze of courage and changed everything. Dust River, Texas, wasn't a place where stories stayed. It was a way station, a patch of sun-bleached earth where wagons paused, not where roots grew. But for Maren Oakes, 17 and already too used to silence, it became the place where her world was left behind. The wagon rattled away down the dirt road, its wheels groaning like they too were tired of carrying Delilah and Thorn Oaks, two parents who drank more than they spoke and blamed their children for every mile of their own misery. No goodbye, no backward glance, no final command, just dust and the ache of being unwanted. Maren didn't call out, didn't cry. She had done that too many times before, and it had earned her nothing but bruises and cold nights on the floorboards. Instead, she held her baby sister Willa tighter, wrapped trembling arms around the younger two siblings huddled beside her, and watched the wagon shrink into the horizon like a memory already being buried. The house behind them sagged with rot and regret, shutters broken, the door swinging loose, windows punched through by time and temper. Their home had been sold out from under them to pay for debts Maren had never made and meals she had never eaten. The wind pressed against her face like a challenge, and the porch beneath her groaned again, as if mourning the children left to survive without a name, without protection. That day, Maren wasn't just abandoned. She was discarded, unnamed, stripped of every illusion that blood meant loyalty or love. And in the shadow of that collapsing home, with no one coming to save her, Maren Oakes made a quiet vow. They may have left me with nothing, but I will not disappear. That night, the sky above Dust River bruised into violet and ash. The wind howled through the splintered bones of the Oakes house, whispering warnings only the forgotten could hear. But Maren didn't flinch. With trembling fingers, she scraped together damp sticks, fallen branches, moldy bark, a shredded newspaper page half buried in the dirt. It wasn't much. It smelled of mildew and desperation. But she sparked a flame anyway, small, hissing, flickering with more smoke than heat. Still, it glowed, and in that moment, it was hers. She gathered her siblings close, pulling Willa into her lap, wrapping her worn shawl around the smallest one's feet. The others leaned into her without question, not because she had answers, but because she had stayed. Her voice was no louder than the fire's whisper, but the words she spoke were clear. That name, Oakes, it's not mine anymore. She didn't spit it like a curse. She released it like a breath that had been trapped too long, a final exhale of everything she no longer owed to people who had walked away. No food, no coin, no walls that kept the wind out, and no name that meant anything worth holding, but they had her, and she would not break. She didn't believe in miracles, but she believed in fire. And even if it was small, smoky, and this stung her eyes, it reminded her that something could still burn. Something could still live. The world had not ended that day, but the girl who bore someone else's name had. From the ashes of that porch, something else was beginning to take shape. Not a rescue, not a rebellion, just the quiet rise of a girl who would not disappear. Not now, not ever. Silas Beckett wasn't searching for lost souls that morning. He was riding the boundary fence, checking for breaks, fixing what the wind or coyotes had undone. The land didn't talk back, and that's the way he liked it. But as his horse crested the rise overlooking the edge of Dust River, something pulled him to a stop. Below him sat a porch leaning under its own sorrow, and beneath that porch, 4 figures huddled like smoke. Children, barely upright, one older, the others tucked behind her like shadows clinging to the last solid shape in the wind. He dismounted slowly, dust swirling around his boots. The girl didn't flinch, didn't beg, just stared back at him with eyes dark as flint. "You got a name?" he asked, voice low, almost hesitant. She paused as if measuring whether it was worth answering. "Just Maren," she said at last. No last name, no explanation, no apology. Silas didn't press. He just nodded once. Not with pity, but with something quieter. Recognition. He knew what it meant to walk around carrying only half a name, the other half too heavy or too poisoned to say aloud. He didn't offer help, didn't ask more. Just tipped his hat and turned his horse back toward the hills. But his gaze lingered longer than it should have. Something about the way she stood, barely taller than her siblings, but somehow still shielding them from the wind, unsettled something in him. He wouldn't admit it, not even to himself, but a question had settled beneath his ribs. Who leaves a girl like that to fend for everyone else? He didn't have an answer, but the dust behind his boots knew. He'd be back. Silas Beckett never asked another question. He didn't return with speeches or sermons. He returned with silence and something wrapped in cloth. The first time, it was a loaf of bread, still warm, tucked near the gate before dawn. The second, a bundle of firewood, dry, clean, carefully split. Then a tin of beans. Then a small pouch of salt. No note, no knock, no explanation. Just quiet offerings placed gently at the edge of their broken world. At first, Maren thought it might be a trick, some twisted charity wrapped in guilt. She waited behind the porch watching for strings, waiting for someone to show up and demand something in return. But no one ever came. The bread wasn't poisoned, the firewood never splintered, the salt never ran out. And slowly she stopped waiting with suspicion. She began watching with wonder. Not all rescue comes with fanfare. Some arrives in silence, in the form of small things left by someone who expects nothing back. Kindness, real kindness, doesn't make noise. It simply shows up. And for someone like Maren, who had grown up believing help came only with cruelty attached, it was a lesson in trust she never thought she'd be offered. She never thanked him, not with words. He never expected her to. But the children ate slower now. Not like they were afraid each bite would be their last. The fire burned longer. The nights felt less like punishment and more like passage. She didn't know what to call this new rhythm between her and Silas. But she knew one thing. He wasn't trying to save her. He was just showing up. And for her, that was something sacred. The sun hadn't fully risen when Maren Oakes arrived at Silas Beckett's ranch, her boots kicking up frost-laced dust. She clutched a bundle in her arms. Bread, salt, dried meat, everything he'd left her over the past week. She placed it on the porch and knocked once. When Silas opened the door, she didn't waver. "I'm not a charity case," she said, voice tight but even. He looked at her, then down at the bundle. "Good," he replied. "Take it out and work." That was all. No lecture, no lecture, no kindness softened by apology, just an even trade. And so she stayed. Maren began by sweeping the porch, then the barn. She cleaned out troughs, raked hay, and hauled buckets nearly as heavy as her siblings. Her hands blistered from rope and splinters. Her shoulders ached from hauling wood. But she didn't ask for rest, and he didn't offer it. She rose before the sun, fed the chickens, and made sure every fence post stood straight. Silas never hovered, but he noticed things. The way she fed the smallest colt before she touched her own bread. The way she checked on the livestock twice instead of once. And she noticed him too. Not for what he said, because he said almost nothing, but for what he didn't say. He never called her girl, never asked about her past, never once made her feel small. Silas didn't give pity, he gave space, and Maren filled it. Not with pleas, but with sweat, silence, and stubbornness. At night, when the barn went still, and her arms could barely lift a brush, she would sit by the fire he built and sip bone broth made from nothing more than water and time. She never said thank you, but he never asked her to, and somehow that made her want to stay even more. The fire crackled low that evening, casting long shadows against the walls of the barn. Maren sat cross-legged on the worn floorboards, a tin cup of broth cupped in her hands. Across from her, Silas Beckett leaned back against a bale of hay, slowly oiling the blade of his pocket knife, saying little as usual. Outside, the prairie winds howled, but inside the silence was warm. She watched him for a while before speaking. By the firelight one evening, Maren said softly, "You never asked my last name." Silas didn't look up right away. Then he replied, "Anyone who survives what you did deserves to choose the name they carry." She didn't respond, but the word stayed. Days later in the stable, she found it, carved into the beam, plain and steady. Maren Beckett. No fanfare, no request, just a name, offered, not imposed. She traced the letters, whispering them once, not as something given, but something earned, and it felt like hers. The old oak's house looked even smaller than Maren remembered. The roof sagged under the weight of years and storms. The windows were little more than gaping holes. The porch creaked like a tired old man with every step she took. It didn't feel like home, but it was all they had. Still, Maren swept the dust from the floorboards, patched holes in the walls with cloth and nails, and wiped years of silence from the windows. She moved with purpose, even if her bones ached and her hands shook. Her siblings followed quietly behind her, Willa clutching her doll, the others too tired to speak, but too hopeful to sit still. By dusk, she was on her knees, scrubbing the hearth with a rag, when she heard footsteps crunching the gravel outside. She rose and stepped out onto the porch, just as Silas Beckett arrived, a coil of rope and a sack of tools slung over one shoulder. He didn't speak, just looked at the door, then at her. "I didn't ask you to come," she said, crossing her arms. Silas glanced up from under his hat, eyes calm. That's what made it easier. He walked past her without another word and got to work. The hinges groaned as he removed them, then clicked softly as he reset them with care. Maren didn't stop him. She just stood there watching, arms still folded, half pride, half gratitude. He didn't ask for thanks. She didn't offer any. But when the door swung closed without slamming for the first time in years, it sounded like peace. Maybe not the loud, joyful kind, but the kind that builds slowly, one repair at a time. The wagon arrived at dawn, its wheels groaning over the dirt like the past clawing its way back. Two men sat atop it, one older, heavy-set with a slanted hat and a cigarette dangling from his lip, the other younger, mean-eyed and smug. Both wore coats stitched with a crude antler crest. Kin, at least by name, but not by heart. They stepped down with the arrogance of ownership, boots kicking up the dust near the porch where Maren stood. Willa clung to her leg. The boys stayed just inside, watching from the window, eyes wide. "You must be Maren," the older one drawled, scanning the house like he was already taking inventory. "We're family. Blood. Thought we'd come collect the little ones. Kids shouldn't be left with strangers." He didn't smile. He smirked, like he expected her to fold. But before Maren could speak, Silas Beckett appeared. He walked from the barn slow and steady, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. No gun, no threats, just calm certainty. "They're not sacks of grain," Silas said, voice low. "And you're not family just because you share a name." The younger man scoffed. "You got no claim, no marriage, no paper. What gives you the right?" Silas didn't blink. "I'm the one who stayed." The air cracked with silence. Even the birds stopped singing. Then Maren stepped forward. Her voice was firm. "I don't need blood that only shows up when it's convenient. I don't need kin who vanished when things got hard. I choose the man who brought food when no one else did, who fixed our door when it fell apart, who didn't ask for anything but gave everything." She reached for Silas' hand, their fingers locking like roots in hard soil. "I choose the one who stayed, not the ones who ran." The townsfolk began to appear, quiet at first, the blacksmith leaning against his anvil, the baker wiping her hands on her apron, the preacher standing near the fence, arms crossed. One by one they nodded, said nothing, but stood there present. Then Maren looked the older man in the eye. "My name is Maren Beckett now," she said. "I chose it with my hands, with my heart, and I don't regret it." The men stared a moment too long, but they saw what everyone else did. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The old barn had once been nothing more than a shelter for rusted tools and forgotten feed. But under Maren's hands and with Silas quietly mending the broken beams, it became something else. They swept years of dust from the rafters, hauled out warped crates, hung blankets over drafty slats to hold in the warmth. The floor was uneven, the windows cracked, but the space slowly began to breathe again. They didn't build a school with money. They built it with will. Maren gathered slates from the preacher's wife. Silas repurposed a broken wagon into benches. The first day, only her siblings came. Then 2 more children. Then 5. Kids who had been labeled too wild or too poor to bother teaching. Some flinched when she raised her voice. Others didn't know how to spell their own names. So she started there. Her first lesson was just one word, written in white chalk across the blackboard. Name, not math, not history. Because before a child can carry knowledge, they need to carry a sense that they matter. Maren stood before them not as a teacher by training, but by fire. She taught with a calm voice and eyes that had seen what forgetting yourself could do. She told them, "Your name is not what someone else gives you. It's what you decide to carry." The room stayed silent, but a few backs straightened. One girl even whispered her name aloud, for the first time in weeks. Over time, something began to shift. One boy, once mute with fear, whispered the word sister for the first time. A girl who never made eye contact began raising her hand. These weren't academic victories, they were reclamations of self. In that barn, under a leaking roof and beside a broken stove, a dozen forgotten children learned not just letters, but that they mattered. And sometimes, when the lessons ended, they stayed, just to hear her say their names one more time. And in that moment, Maren knew this barn was more than shelter. It was a place where lost things were remembered, and where names could be chosen, not inherited. There were no flowers on the table, no candlelight, no practiced speech. Just a quiet evening, a low-burning lantern, and the soft clatter of dishes being put away in the corner of the barn that now doubled as a school and a home. Silas Beckett sat at the teacher's desk, fingers tracing the grain of the wood. Something folded in his hand. Maren stood by the window, watching the wind tug at the curtain like it, too, had questions. He didn't clear his throat, didn't ask for her attention. He simply slid a paper across the table. She turned, brows drawn, and picked it up carefully. A marriage application. Blank, except for one sentence written in his square, deliberate handwriting at the bottom. "She can choose to carry my name, but I've carried her for a long time already." No pressure, no plea, just space, just choice. Maren didn't say anything at first. Her eyes scanned the page, then lifted to his face. He looked at her the way he always had, without expectation, without demand, just steady and sure. She didn't smile, not exactly, but something inside her unknotted. Without a word, she walked across the room, picked up a piece of chalk, and stood before the blackboard. With slow, certain strokes, she wrote, "Maren Beckett," not as a question, as a declaration. Then she turned to him, voice low but strong. "I do not carry shame anymore." Silas blinked once, slow, like a man watching something bloom he never dared to plant. His hand stayed still, but his chest rose with a breath that seemed to carry years of waiting. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. There in that quiet barn, something sacred was exchanged. Not rings, not signatures, but understanding. And it was enough. Silas rose, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because in her voice, in that name, in that one quiet act, they had both already said yes. No one clapped. No one watched. But the wind outside seemed to pause. And somewhere between the chalk, dust, and firelight, a vow was made. They didn't marry in a chapel. There were no stained glass windows or polished pews. Just open sky, sun-warmed earth, and the scent of pine and wildflowers carried on the breeze. The ceremony took place behind the old barn, now a schoolhouse. Silas Beckett had hammered together a simple wooden arch from scrap pine, and Maren had woven wildflowers, lavender, sage, clover, into its beams with her own hands. The townspeople came not in fine clothes, but in what they had: patched vests, sun-faded dresses, boots scuffed by labor. They came not for spectacle, but for love they had seen built slowly, stubbornly, from silence and grit. Maren wore no veil, just a plain linen dress sewn by 3 women from town, and a braid tied with her mother's old ribbon, not to honor her, but to remember what she survived. Silas wore his only clean shirt, sleeves rolled once at the cuff. He had shaved that morning, not to look handsome, but to show he'd come ready, ready to stand, ready to stay. There was no music, just wind threading through the grass and the soft creak of the arch. When the preacher asked if they had words to share, Silas raised his head, eyes steady. "I don't need someone who shares my blood," he said. "I need someone who brings fire home and keeps it burning." Then Maren stepped forward, her voice clear. "A name isn't what you're born with. It's what you fight for. And today, I choose mine." They didn't kiss for show. They didn't cry. They simply joined hands, worn, calloused, real, and stood rooted like trees grown from the same storm. Afterward, the kitchen at the Beckett home overflowed with flour, laughter, and sticky fingers. The children made a mess of everything, and no one stopped them. And in that small home built of wood and work and second chances, the fire never stopped burning. It still hasn't. Some names we're born with. Others we earn. Through quiet defiance, through years of surviving when we should have been held, and through choosing love over legacy. Maren Beckett's story reminds us that family isn't defined by blood, but by who stays when it rains. It's a lesson many of us have learned the hard way, through broken homes, lost connections, or moments when silence became louder than words. In a world that still tries to label people by where they come from, this story dares to ask a deeper question. Who are you when no one is watching? And more importantly, who do you choose to become? Silas Beckett didn't offer pity, he offered space. Maren didn't ask for rescue. She built something from nothing. And together they created a home, not from shared history but shared hope. Maybe you've lived through seasons of abandonment. Maybe you've raised children who weren't your own. Maybe you're that grandmother raising grandkids while your own children drifted away. Maybe you're the stepfather who shows up for every school play, even when they still call you Mister. Or maybe, like Maren, you're learning to give yourself the name no one ever offered you. Some say blood is thicker than water, but sometimes it's the water that nourishes us and the fire that saves us. What do you think? Is family something we're born into or something we build? Let us know in the comments. Your story could be the spark someone else is waiting for. Or maybe, like Maren, you've had to rename your life to reclaim your peace. If so, this story was for you. Share your story in the comments. Let others know they're not alone. And if this tale moved you, if it reminded you of something you lost or helped you believe in something still possible, please like, subscribe, and join our growing circle of hearts drawn to warmth, not blood. We tell stories for people like you, people who believe that fire, once lit, can change everything. So stay close. There are more stories waiting, right here, by the fire.